Picture this. You're a confident, accomplished woman who's navigated decades of life experience. You've raised children, built careers, survived heartbreak, and emerged stronger. You know what you want, and you're not willing to settle for less. Then you meet someone who seems perfect. He says all the right things, makes you feel seen in ways you haven't felt in years, and suddenly, you find yourself questioning your own perceptions. You wonder if you're being too critical, too guarded, too suspicious. Sound familiar? Here's what most people won't tell you. The most dangerous forms of emotional manipulation aren't the obvious ones. They're not the screaming matches or the blatant lies. They're the subtle undermining of your confidence, the gentle erosion of your boundaries, the slow rewiring of your reality until you don't trust your own judgment anymore. And the truly insidious part? The tactics used against mature, experienced women are often more sophisticated precisely because manipulators know they're dealing with someone who's seen it all before. If you've ever found yourself making excuses for someone's behavior, if you've ever felt crazy for being upset about something that seems small, if you've ever wondered why you feel so anxious in a relationship that's supposed to make you happy, then this video is for you. We're going to dive deep into the subtle signs that you're being played emotionally, signs so refined that even the most perceptive woman might miss them. Before we begin, I want you to do me a favor. If this content resonates with you, if it helps you see something you've been missing, please hit that like button. It tells me you find value in this work. Drop a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences, even anonymously if you prefer. Your stories help other women feel less alone. Share this video with any woman in your life who might benefit from this information, because awareness is the first step to protection. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss content designed specifically to empower and protect you. If you're feeling particularly generous and want to support the creation of more content like this, consider thanking the channel with a super thanks. Your support directly enables me to continue this important work. Now, let's get into it. The first subtle sign that you're being played emotionally is something I call the intermittent reinforcement pattern. This is one of the most psychologically powerful manipulation tactics, and it's devastatingly effective precisely because it doesn't feel like manipulation at all. Here's how it works. In the beginning, he's attentive, responsive, and consistent. He texts you good morning, asks about your day, remembers the little details you share, and makes you feel like a priority. This establishes a baseline of what you can expect from him. Then, gradually and without warning, the attention becomes unpredictable. Some days he's warm and engaged. Other days he's distant and unavailable. Some weeks he's planning future trips together. Other weeks he's too busy to commit to a simple coffee date. The brilliance of this tactic, from a manipulator's perspective, is that it creates an addiction-like response in your brain. Research in behavioral psychology shows that intermittent reinforcement, where rewards are given unpredictably, creates stronger behavioral patterns than consistent reinforcement. It's the same principle that makes gambling addictive. When you don't know if pulling the lever will result in a jackpot or nothing, you keep pulling, hoping for that next hit of dopamine. In relationships, this translates to you working harder for his attention and approval. When he's warm, you feel relieved and validated. When he's cold, you analyze everything you might have done wrong. You become hyper-vigilant to his moods, constantly trying to figure out what version of him you'll get today. You start modifying your behavior, hoping to bring back the consistent man you met in the beginning, not realizing that consistent man was a performance designed to hook you. What makes this particularly subtle is that he'll have perfectly reasonable explanations for his inconsistency. He's stressed at work, he's dealing with family issues, he's not good at communicating when he's overwhelmed. These explanations aren't necessarily lies, but they become tools to deflect accountability. And because you're a mature, empathetic woman who understands that people have complex lives, you accept these explanations. You give him the benefit of the doubt. You pride yourself on not being needy or demanding. But here's the truth. Genuine stress or life challenges might affect someone's availability, but they don't fundamentally change how much someone values you or their basic patterns of respect and communication. A man who truly cares will tell you when he's going through something difficult. He'll say he might be less available, but he still wants you in his life. He won't leave you guessing, wondering, or feeling anxious about where you stand. The second subtle sign is what I call subtle boundary erosion. This is different from someone who blatantly disrespects your boundaries from the start. This is a slow, almost imperceptible process where your boundaries are tested, pushed, and eventually crossed in ways that leave you questioning whether you're being too rigid or unreasonable. It starts small. You mention that you prefer not to discuss certain topics, like your finances or your past relationships, early in dating. He respects this at first, but then asks about these topics in roundabout ways. He frames it as wanting to know you better, as being genuinely interested in your life. When you redirect the conversation, he might seem slightly hurt or say something like, "I just want to feel close to you," or "I thought we were past keeping secrets." Notice what's happening here. Your boundary, which was clear and reasonable, is being reframed as a barrier to intimacy, as something that's preventing the relationship from deepening. The implication is that if you maintain this boundary, you're the one creating distance. You're the one being closed off. This is a masterful manipulation because it takes your healthy self-protection and turns it into a relationship problem that you're responsible for fixing. Or perhaps you've established that you need a certain amount of alone time to recharge. You're not being antisocial. You're honoring your needs. Initially, he says he understands and respects this. Then, gradually, he starts showing up unannounced during your alone time. He calls it spontaneous and romantic. He says he missed you and couldn't wait to see you. If you express that this disrupts your plans, he might act confused or hurt. He thought you'd be happy to see him. He was just being thoughtful. Suddenly, you're the bad guy for not appreciating his spontaneity. The pattern continues with other boundaries. Maybe you've said you're not comfortable with him checking your phone, but he picks it up to change the music and happens to see a text. He makes a comment about it, framing it as casual observation, not snooping. Maybe you've expressed that you want to take the physical relationship slowly, but he consistently pushes for more, always stopping just before you get truly upset, but making you feel like you're being prudish or withholding. What makes this so subtle is that each individual incident seems minor. You tell yourself you're overreacting. You don't want to be the woman who makes a big deal out of small things. But here's what you need to understand. Boundary erosion is never about the individual incidents. It's about the pattern. It's about someone systematically testing to see what they can get away with, training you to accept progressively more disrespect. A healthy partner doesn't just respect your boundaries, they champion them. They understand that your boundaries exist to protect your well-being, and they want you to be well. They don't take your boundaries personally because they understand that boundaries aren't rejections of them, they're affirmations of your self-respect. When you're with someone who truly values you, maintaining your boundaries doesn't create conflict, it creates safety. The third subtle sign is strategic vulnerability. This one is particularly insidious because it masquerades as emotional intimacy. He shares deeply personal stories about his past, his pain, his struggles. He cries in front of you. He tells you things he claims he's never told anyone else. You feel honored by this trust. You feel like you're seeing the real him, the vulnerable man beneath the confident exterior. This creates a powerful bond. You feel protective of him. You feel special for being the one he's opened up to. But here's where it gets complicated. While genuine vulnerability is a cornerstone of real intimacy. Strategic vulnerability is a manipulation tactic. The difference lies in the timing, the content, and the purpose of the sharing. Strategic vulnerability happens too quickly. He's sharing deep traumas and insecurities before you've established real trust or history together. This creates a false sense of intimacy, a feeling that you're much closer than you actually are. The content of strategic vulnerability often positions him as a victim. He's been hurt by his ex-wife who didn't understand him. He's been betrayed by friends who took advantage of his kindness. He's been overlooked at work despite his talents. Notice a pattern? He's always the wronged party, never someone who's made mistakes, learned from them, and grown. This victimhood serves multiple purposes. It makes you want to be different from all those people who hurt him. It makes you work extra hard to prove that you're trustworthy, understanding, and supportive. It also preemptively excuses his future bad behavior. When he eventually does something hurtful, he can point back to his vulnerability. He can remind you of his past trauma. He can frame his hurtful actions as wounds from his past, not choices in his present. You've been primed to be understanding, to make allowances, to be the woman who doesn't give up on him like everyone else did. Meanwhile, you notice that this exchange of vulnerability is one-sided. When you share your own pain or struggles, his response is often dismissive, superficial, or somehow turns the conversation back to him. Strategic vulnerability also creates a debt. He's given you something precious, his authentic self, his pain, his trust. Now you owe him. You owe him patience when he's difficult. You owe him understanding when he's inconsistent. You owe him loyalty even when he doesn't reciprocate it. This is the unspoken contract created by strategic vulnerability, and it's completely unhealthy. Genuine vulnerability, in contrast, is reciprocal. It develops gradually as trust is earned. It includes acknowledgement of personal responsibility, not just victimhood. It doesn't come with expectations or strings attached. And crucially, when someone is genuinely vulnerable with you, they also create space for your vulnerability. They don't use their pain as a trump card to invalidate yours. The fourth subtle sign is manufactured jealousy. This is a tactic where he deliberately creates situations designed to make you jealous, anxious, or insecure, all while maintaining plausible deniability. He's not doing anything wrong, technically, but you can't shake the feeling that something's off. He might mention a female friend or co-worker frequently, always in positive terms. He talks about how funny she is, how smart, how attractive other men find her. When you express discomfort, he acts surprised. He's just being honest. He thought you were secure enough to handle him having female friends. He might even suggest that your discomfort reveals insecurity or trust issues on your part. Suddenly, you're the problem, not his behavior. Or he might leave his phone face up on the table where you can see notifications from other women popping up. He doesn't hide it exactly, but he also doesn't explain it. The names might include heart emojis or intimate nicknames. If you ask about it, he has reasonable explanations. She's just a friend. Those are inside jokes. He can't control how other people talk to him. The message is clear. Other women want him. Other women find him desirable, and you should feel grateful that he's chosen you. Some men will go further, creating scenarios where you're likely to see him interacting with other women in flirtatious ways. He accepts every invitation to social events where his ex will be present. He insists on maintaining close friendships with women he has a romantic history with. He tells you about women who've expressed interest in him, framing it as something he's rejecting, but the subtext is clear. If you don't treat him right, he has options. The purpose of manufactured jealousy is to keep you in a state of competition and anxiety. It ensures that you're always trying to prove your worth, always working to keep his interest, always feeling like you could be replaced. This is particularly effective with mature women because society already sends the message that older women are in competition with younger women for male attention. A manipulator exploits this existing insecurity. What makes this subtle is that each incident, taken individually, might seem defensible. He is allowed to have female friends. He can't control who texts him. He's not responsible for other women's interest in him. But the pattern reveals the truth. A man who values you doesn't cultivate your insecurity. He doesn't create situations where you're forced to wonder about his fidelity or commitment. He doesn't use other women's interest as leverage in your relationship. A healthy man proactively creates security. He's transparent about his friendships. He sets appropriate boundaries with other women. He makes you feel chosen, not just for now, but continuously. He doesn't need you to be jealous or anxious to feel desired. Your peace of mind is more important to him than the ego boost of keeping you on edge. The fifth subtle sign is something I call selective amnesia. This is when he conveniently forgets conversations, promises, agreements, or events that don't serve his current narrative or desires. What makes this particularly crazy-making is that he doesn't forget everything, just the things that would hold him accountable. You had a conversation where he promised to include you in his holiday plans. When the holidays approach and no plans have been made, you bring it up. He looks at you blankly. He doesn't remember that conversation. Or he remembers it differently. He thought you were just discussing possibilities, not making firm plans. You're certain of what was said. But his confidence in his version of events makes you question your own memory. This happens repeatedly. He forgets that he said he'd call at a certain time. He forgets that you had plans. He forgets that you told him something was important to you. But he remembers with perfect clarity every time you were late, every time you cancelled plans, every time you said something that could be construed as critical. His memory is selectively functional, working perfectly when it comes to your shortcomings and mysteriously failing when it comes to his own commitments. What's particularly insidious about selective amnesia is that it makes you doubt yourself. You start second-guessing your own recollections. Maybe you did misunderstand. Maybe you're remembering wrong. Maybe you're being too sensitive or expecting too much. Over time, you might even start documenting conversations, keeping texts as proof, taking screenshots, because you've learned that you can't trust him to remember accurately, and you can't trust yourself to convince him of what was really said. This is a form of gaslighting, and it's devastatingly effective. It undermines your confidence in your own perceptions and experiences. It makes you dependent on his version of reality. It means he's never truly accountable because he can always claim not to remember or to remember differently. And because he's so convincing, because his certainty never wavers, you start to believe that maybe the problem is your memory, not his integrity. A person with genuine memory issues would forget things randomly, not just selectively. They'd be apologetic about their forgetfulness and would take steps to improve, like writing things down or setting reminders. They certainly wouldn't remember your mistakes with perfect clarity while forgetting their own. When someone's memory failures consistently benefit them and disadvantage you, that's not a memory problem. That's a character problem. The sixth subtle sign is what I call the compliment-criticism sandwich, but done so skillfully that you barely notice the criticism. He praises you, then inserts a subtle dig, then praises you again. The positive comments cushion the blow of the negative one, making it harder to object without seeming ungrateful or oversensitive. He might say something like, "I love how confident you are. You're not afraid to speak your mind, even when you might be wrong about something. It's refreshing." On the surface, this seems like a compliment. He's calling you confident and refreshing. But embedded in there is the suggestion that you speak your mind even when wrong, implying that you're often wrong but too confident to realize it. Or he might say, "You look beautiful today. I love that you don't feel like you need to dress up all the time like younger women do." Again, it sounds positive. He's calling you beautiful and implying you're secure and low maintenance. But the comparison to younger women and the suggestion that you don't dress up is actually saying you don't make an effort with your appearance and positioning this as related to your age. These backhanded compliments serve multiple purposes. They undermine your confidence while maintaining his image as someone who's supportive and complimentary. If you object to the criticism embedded in the compliment, he can point to the positive parts and accuse you of being unable to take a compliment, of being too sensitive, of looking for problems where none exist. Over time, these subtle criticisms accumulate. You might notice that you're second-guessing yourself more. You're wondering if you talk too much, if you're too opinionated, if you're letting yourself go, if you're too emotional, if you're not fun enough, adventurous enough, young enough. Each individual comment seemed harmless, even positive, but collectively, they've chipped away at your self-esteem. What makes this particularly cruel is that it denies you the right to openly address the disrespect. If he called you stupid, old, or unattractive, you could clearly identify that as unacceptable and respond accordingly. But when the insults are wrapped in compliments, when they're delivered with a smile, when they're cushioned by praise, how do you object? How do you explain that the way he compliments you actually makes you feel worse? A genuinely supportive partner compliments you without qualifications. They don't need to tear you down while building you up. Their praise doesn't come with comparisons that make you feel inadequate. They understand that real compliments are unambiguous, unconditional, and affirming. If someone's compliments consistently leave you feeling worse rather than better, that's a sign that the intent isn't to build you up, it's to keep you insecure. The seventh subtle sign is isolation by insinuation. This is different from obvious isolation where someone forbids you from seeing friends or family. This is much more sophisticated. He never tells you who you can or can't see. Instead, he makes it progressively more uncomfortable or complicated for you to maintain your other relationships. He might start by making subtle, critical comments about your friends. He doesn't say you shouldn't see them. He just observes that they seem negative, or they drink too much, or they're not as successful as you are, or they're stuck in the past. He frames it as concern for you, suggesting that these relationships might be holding you back, or that you've outgrown these people. Because you value his opinion, you start seeing your friends through his critical lens. You start noticing their flaws more and appreciating their value less. Or he creates scheduling conflicts. Every time you plan to see friends or family, he suddenly has something important come up that requires your presence. It's not that he's forbidding you to go. He's just disappointed that you're choosing them over this special thing he planned. He might even encourage you to go, but do it in a way that's loaded with guilt. Of course, go see your friends. I'll just be here alone, missing you. But you should definitely go. Some men will be even more subtle. They'll join you for gatherings with your friends or family, but make the experience unpleasant. They might be charming to everyone, but subtly punish you afterward. In the car on the way home, they're critical of how you acted, what you said, how much you drank. They point out how your friends talked over you or didn't seem to value your opinions. They might even suggest that you seem different around them, not your authentic self. The message is clear. When you're with other people, problems arise. When you're alone with him, things are better. Over time, you see your friends less frequently. You skip family gatherings. You make excuses, telling yourself and others that you're just busy, that you're prioritizing your relationship, that you're in a new phase of life. You don't realize that your precession support system, the people who know you, love you, and would tell you if they were concerned about how you're being treated, has been systematically weakened. This isolation serves a crucial purpose for an emotional manipulator. It removes outside perspectives that might contradict his narrative. Your friends might notice that you seem different, quieter, less confident. They might question some of his behaviors that you've rationalized. They might remind you of who you were before this relationship, creating cognitive dissonance with who you've become. By distancing you from them, he ensures that his voice is the loudest, perhaps the only one, in your life. A healthy partner encourages your connections. They understand that your relationships with friends and family existed before them and enrich your life. They don't see these relationships as competition for your time and attention. They're secure enough not to need you all to themselves. They want you to be supported, loved, and connected to a community because they genuinely care about your well-being, not just about controlling your world. The eighth subtle sign is what I call emotional hostage-taking. This is when he uses his own emotional state as a tool to control your behavior, making you responsible for managing his feelings while neglecting your own. It's different from someone who's genuinely struggling with mental health issues and communicating their needs. This is strategic deployment of emotional distress. When you try to address a problem in the relationship, he becomes disproportionately upset. He might not yell or become aggressive, but he shuts down completely. He looks devastated. He might cry. He might say things like, "I can't believe you think so poorly of me," or "I'm such a terrible partner, aren't I?" The conversation, which was supposed to be about your legitimate concern, becomes about comforting him and reassuring him that he's not a bad person. This pattern trains you to avoid bringing up problems. You learn that addressing issues doesn't lead to resolution. It leads to you having to manage his emotional crisis. Eventually, it feels easier to just let things go, to swallow your hurt, to convince yourself that whatever bothered you wasn't that important anyway. This is exactly the outcome he's engineering, perhaps even consciously. Or he might use threats of self-harm or emotional collapse as leverage. He says he can't live without you. He claims you're the only thing keeping him going. If you express doubts about the relationship or need space, he implies or directly states that he doesn't know what he'd do without you. The suggestion, subtle or overt, is that his well-being, perhaps even his life, is in your hands. The weight of this responsibility is enormous. How can you leave someone who needs you so desperately? How can you prioritize your own needs when his mental health is at stake? What makes this particularly effective with mature, empathetic women is that we've been socialized to be caretakers. We're taught that our value lies partly in our ability to nurture, to heal, to support. A manipulator exploits this. He positions himself as someone who needs your care, making it feel cruel or selfish to prioritize your own needs or to enforce boundaries that might upset him. But here's the crucial truth. You are not responsible for another adult's emotional regulation. A healthy person manages their own emotions. They might feel sad or disappointed when you set a boundary or raise a concern, but they don't collapse. They don't make you responsible for fixing their feelings. They certainly don't use the threat of emotional harm as a tool to control your behavior. Moreover, genuine emotional distress doesn't conveniently appear only when you're asserting yourself. If someone consistently falls apart only when you're trying to address your needs or concerns, that's not authentic vulnerability, that's manipulation. A truly struggling person would show signs of distress at other times, in other contexts, not just when it serves to silence you or derail difficult conversations. The ninth subtle sign is progressive goal-post moving. This is when the standards for his satisfaction, commitment, or respect continuously change, ensuring that you can never quite reach them. Just when you think you've met his expectations, they shift. Early in the relationship, he expresses what he's looking for in a partner. Maybe he values independence and career ambition. You embody these qualities, and he seems to appreciate them. Then, once the relationship is established, he starts making comments about how you work too much, how you're always busy, how he wishes you made more time for the relationship. The quality he claimed to value is now framed as a problem. Or perhaps he said he wanted someone who's laid back and easygoing. You pride yourself on being low maintenance and flexible. Then he starts complaining that you don't have opinions about where to go or what to do. He wishes you'd be more decisive or take more initiative in planning. The very trait he said he wanted is now positioned as a flaw. This happens with intimacy too. When you were taking things slowly, physically, he respected that pace and said he appreciated building emotional connection first. Then, once you've crossed certain physical boundaries, he expresses disappointment that you're not as adventurous as he'd like. He makes comparisons, subtle or direct, to previous partners or to some ideal of what a passionate woman should be. You thought you were meeting him where he said he wanted to be met, but the target has moved. The goalpost moving extends to commitment timelines. He talks about future plans, moving in together, meeting families, making it official. You feel secure in these intentions. Then, when the time comes to actualize these plans, he gets cold feet. He needs more time. The circumstances aren't quite right. You need to prove something more, reach some new unstated benchmark. You realize that the future he painted was a carrot to keep you invested, not a genuine plan. What makes this so psychologically damaging is that it creates a permanent state of striving. You're always trying to be better, to be enough, to finally reach the point where he's satisfied and committed. But that point doesn't exist. It can't exist because the entire purpose of moving the goalposts is to keep you in pursuit mode, to maintain his position of power, to ensure you never feel secure enough to relax or make demands of your own. This tactic also serves to blame you for his lack of commitment or satisfaction. It's not that he's non-committal or perpetually dissatisfied, it's that you haven't yet become what he needs you to be. The problem is always your shortcomings, not his dishonesty about what he wants or his unwillingness to commit. You internalize this, believing that if you could just be more of whatever he currently claims to want, the relationship would finally stabilize. A healthy partner knows what they want and communicates it clearly. Their standards are reasonable and consistent. They appreciate who you are, rather than constantly pushing you to become someone else. They don't dangle commitment like a reward you have to earn through endless self-improvement. They choose you as you are, flaws and all, and they don't pretend that's negotiable based on your performance. The 10th subtle sign is what I call strategic incompetence. This is when he deliberately performs tasks poorly or claims inability to do things that he's perfectly capable of, training you to take on more responsibility while he does less. What makes this subtle is that it doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like genuine inability or different standards. He might claim he doesn't know how to do certain household tasks. He's never learned to cook, do laundry properly, clean to an acceptable standard. When he does attempt these tasks, he does them so poorly that it's more work for you to let him do them than to do them yourself. He ruins the laundry by mixing colors and whites. He leaves the kitchen messier after cooking than it was before. He cleans the bathroom but misses obvious dirt. Eventually, you just do these tasks yourself. It's easier. It ensures they're done right. And he's perfectly happy to let you. He might even thank you for being so capable, so good at these things. See how that works? His incompetence is rewarded. Your competence is punished with more work. He's learned that by being bad at things, he can avoid having to do them. This extends beyond household tasks. He might claim emotional incompetence. He's just not good at remembering important dates, at buying thoughtful gifts, at providing emotional support in the way you need. He positions this as just who he is, a fundamental limitation you need to accept. He might even frame it in gendered terms. Men aren't as emotionally aware. Men don't remember details. Men show love through actions, not words. What's crucial to understand is that strategic incompetence is selective. He's somehow competent enough at work to hold down a job. He's competent enough with his hobbies to achieve proficiency. He's competent enough when it comes to things he actually cares about. The incompetence mysteriously appears only in areas where his effort would benefit you or the relationship. Moreover, strategic incompetence is learned helplessness. He's training you to have low expectations. He's teaching you that asking him to contribute equally is futile. He's establishing a relationship dynamic where you're the responsible one, the capable one, the one who manages everything, and he's the one who gets to coast, free from accountability, because he's just not good at these things. A grown adult who's lived independently knows how to take care of basic life tasks. If they genuinely lack a skill, they learn it. They don't use their incompetence as a permanent excuse. They appreciate when you do things for them, but they don't take it for granted or allow imbalance to become the norm. They understand that partnership means equal effort, even if the specific contributions differ. Strategic incompetence isn't a cute quirk or a fixed personality trait. It's a choice to prioritize comfort over equity. The 11th subtle sign is controlled spontaneity. This might sound contradictory, but it's a real pattern. He presents himself as spontaneous, fun-loving, and go with the flow. But this spontaneity only goes one direction. His desires and preferences are followed spontaneously. Yours require planning, consideration, and often negotiation. He surprises you with plans he's made without consulting you. He books a weekend trip, buys tickets to an event, or invites friends over without checking if it works for your schedule. When you express that you had other plans or would have liked to be consulted, he frames your reaction as you being rigid, unable to be spontaneous, or not fun. After all, he's trying to surprise you, to keep things exciting, to show you a good time. Your desire for consideration and communication is positioned as a buzzkill. But notice what happens when you try to be spontaneous about something you want to do. Suddenly, he needs advance notice. He needs to check his schedule. He's not sure if it fits with his other commitments. Your spontaneity isn't charming, it's inconsiderate. Your surprises aren't romantic, they're presumptuous. The double standard is glaring once you see it. This controlled spontaneity also manifests in emotional expression. He wants you to be open and vulnerable with him whenever the mood strikes him. He wants deep conversations at midnight when he's feeling introspective, even if you're exhausted. But when you need to talk about something important to you, he needs to be in the right headspace. The timing isn't good. He's too stressed or tired or distracted. Your emotional needs require perfect conditions. His can be dropped on you at any time. The purpose of controlled spontaneity is to maintain control while appearing easygoing. It allows him to disrupt your plans, your space, and your boundaries while framing it as romantic or fun. It means the relationship runs on his timeline, his moods, his desires. You're expected to be flexible and adaptable, to drop everything for him, to be game for whatever he wants. But he's not expected to offer you the same flexibility or consideration. A truly spontaneous person is spontaneous in ways that consider others. They might surprise you, but they make sure the surprise is actually something you'd enjoy and can accommodate. They're flexible when you have last-minute needs or ideas. They understand that spontaneity in a relationship should add joy, not create chaos or resentment. Real spontaneity is a mutual spirit of adventure and flexibility, not a one-sided expectation that you bend to someone else's whims. The 12th subtle sign is what I call competitive suffering. No matter what you're going through, his problems are worse. No matter how legitimate your feelings, his trump yours. This creates a dynamic where your experiences are constantly minimized and his needs are always prioritized. You mention you had a difficult day at work. He immediately launches into how terrible his day was, how stressed he is, how much pressure he's under. There's no space for him to acknowledge your experience before centering his own. Or, if he does acknowledge yours, it's brief and dismissive. That sounds tough, but let me tell you about what I'm dealing with. You express that you're hurt by something he did. Instead of addressing it, he reminds you of a time you hurt him. He brings up grievances from weeks or months ago, shifting the conversation from your current, valid concern to his historical inventory of times you've wronged him. Suddenly, you're defending yourself rather than receiving an FS, apology, or accountability for the issue you raised. You share a health concern or physical pain you're experiencing. He immediately compares it to his own health issues, often implying that his are more serious or that you're lucky you don't have what he has. There's no empathy for your experience, just a competition to establish whose suffering is greater and therefore more worthy of attention and care. This competitive suffering serves multiple purposes. It trains you to not share your problems or feelings because you know they'll be minimized or one-upped. It positions him as the person who needs and deserves care, support, and consideration, while your needs are secondary. It also prevents accountability. If every time you raise a concern about his behavior, he counters with his own suffering or grievances, he never actually has to address what you're bringing to his attention. What makes this particularly damaging is that it isolates you even within the relationship. You can't turn to your partner for support because he's not offering it. Every bid for empathy becomes a competition you can't win. Over time, you stop sharing. You handle your problems alone. You become emotionally self-sufficient, not by choice, but by necessity. The relationship becomes a place where you give support, but don't receive it. A loving partner can hold space for your experiences without making them about himself. He can acknowledge that you're struggling without needing to prove he's struggling more. He understands that empathy isn't a finite resource. Supporting you doesn't diminish his own needs or experiences. He wants to be a source of comfort for you, not someone who adds to your burdens by requiring you to prioritize his feelings, even when you're the one who's hurting. The 13th subtle sign is accountability theater. This is when he goes through the motions of taking responsibility or apologizing, but doesn't actually change his behavior or make genuine amends. It's performance without substance, designed to get you to drop the issue without him having to do the work of real change. After you've confronted him about a hurtful behavior, he offers a quick apology. "I'm sorry you feel that way." Notice the structure of this apology. It's not, "I'm sorry I hurt you," or "I'm sorry I did that specific thing." It's an apology for your feelings, not for his actions. It subtly positions your feelings as the problem, not his behavior. It's a non-apology disguised as accountability. Or he might give what seems like a real apology. He says he's sorry, that he knows he messed up, that he'll do better. It sounds sincere. You feel heard. You accept the apology and move forward. Then, days or weeks later, the same behavior happens again. When you point this out, he's apologetic again. He really means to change. He's working on it. It's a process. Each time, the apology seems genuine, but the pattern never changes. Some men take this further with grand gestures. After a particularly hurtful incident, he buys you flowers, takes you to a nice dinner, writes you a heartfelt letter. These gestures feel significant. They seem to demonstrate that he understands the gravity of what he did and wants to make it right. But gestures aren't the same as change. The flowers wilt, the dinner ends, the letter goes in a drawer, and the behavior that necessitated the apology continues unchanged. Accountability theater is effective because it mimics real accountability. It has the language of remorse, the appearance of self-awareness, sometimes even the emotion of genuine regret. But it lacks the crucial element that defines real accountability: sustained behavioral change. Real accountability means not just saying you're sorry, but doing the work to ensure you don't repeat the harmful behavior. A manipulator understands that most people don't want to end a relationship over a single incident, especially if the person seems sorry. They want to believe in change, in growth, in the possibility of things getting better. Accountability theater exploits this hope. It provides just enough appearance of change to keep you invested, but not so much actual change that he has to give up his problematic behaviors. If you notice that you're having the same conversations repeatedly, accepting the same apologies for the same behaviors, receiving gestures that feel meaningful in the moment but don't translate to different treatment over time, you're experiencing accountability theater. Real accountability is uncomfortable. It requires someone to look at their behavior honestly, to understand its impact, to identify the underlying beliefs or habits that led to it, and to actively work on changing. It's a process that takes time, but it shows progress. You see different responses, different choices, different patterns emerging. If all you're seeing is apologies on repeat, that's performance, not growth. The 14th subtle sign is something I call emotional forecasting. This is when he preemptively tells you how you're going to feel or react, often in ways that serve his interests or deflect from his behavior. He's essentially scripting your emotions and responses, making it harder for you to honor your actual feelings. He might say something hurtful and then immediately follow it with, "Don't be upset," or "I knew you'd be mad about this," or "You're going to overreact." But notice what's happening. He's telling you what your emotional response will or should be before you've even fully processed what he's said or done. This serves multiple purposes. It positions any upset you express as predictable and perhaps unreasonable. After all, he warned you that you'd react this way, implying that your reaction is the problem, not his action. Or he makes a decision that affects both of you and says, "I know you're going to be fine with this." He's not asking if you're fine with it. He's declaring that you will be. If you then express that you're not fine with it, you're contradicting his forecast, making you seem difficult or contrary. The expectation that you'd be fine has been established, so not being fine makes you the problem. This emotional forecasting also shows up in positive forms that are equally manipulative. He might say, "You're going to love this," before presenting you with something you didn't ask for and might not actually want. Or, "I know you're going to be so proud of me when I tell you this." He's scripting positive emotions you're supposed to feel, creating pressure to perform those emotions even if they're not authentic. What makes emotional forecasting particularly insidious is that it undermines your trust in your own emotional responses. When someone repeatedly tells you how you're going to feel, and then you feel that way, it can seem like they know you well, but often you're conforming to their forecast, not authentically experiencing that emotion. Or, if you feel differently than predicted, you start to question yourself. Maybe you're being unreasonable. Maybe you should feel differently. This tactic also prevents genuine communication. Instead of asking how you feel, he tells you how you feel or will feel. Instead of being curious about your actual responses, he projects his assumptions. This means he never has to truly listen or adjust based on your real reactions, because he's already decided what those reactions are or should be. A respectful partner doesn't presume to know your feelings better than you do. They ask. They create space for you to express your authentic emotional responses. They're curious about your inner world rather than projecting onto it. They understand that even if they know you well, you're entitled to surprise them, to feel differently than expected, to have complex or contradictory emotions. Your feelings aren't a script to be written by someone else. They're your own experience to be honored and respected. The 15th subtle sign is what I call strategic transparency. This is when he shares information about himself, his past, or his behavior in ways that seem honest and open, but are actually calculated to control the narrative and preempt criticism. He tells you, early on, that he's not good at relationships. He's been told he's emotionally unavailable. His ex said he was selfish. By sharing these criticisms himself, he seems self-aware and honest, but what he's actually doing is giving himself a pass. When he later demonstrates emotional unavailability or selfishness, you can't act surprised. He warned you. He was upfront about his limitations. If you're disappointed, that's on you for thinking you could change him or for ignoring the red flags he waved in your face. Or he admits to specific bad behaviors from his past. He cheated in a previous relationship. He has a temper. He struggles with jealousy. Again, this seems like honesty, like someone taking accountability for their flaws. But notice that these admissions come without evidence of change. He's not saying he used to do these things and has worked on himself. He's saying he does these things, framing it as just part of who he is. When these behaviors show up in your relationship, you're expected to accept them because he was honest about them. Strategic transparency also shows up in real-time disclosure. He tells you when other women flirt with him or express interest. He shows you messages from his ex. He shares that he was tempted to do something that would hurt the relationship but chose not to. This seems like openness, like someone committed to honesty in the relationship, but it's actually a manipulation. He's making you grateful for the baseline of decent behavior. He's positioning himself as honest even while creating jealousy or insecurity, and he's setting a precedent that his transparency deserves credit, even when what he's being transparent about is problematic. The brilliance of strategic transparency from a manipulator's perspective is that it makes you feel like you have no grounds to complain. He was honest. He told you who he was. If you're unhappy with his behavior, you're the one who chose to stay despite knowing. The accountability shifts from him to you. His bad behavior isn't the problem. Your choice to be with him despite that behavior is. What's missing from strategic transparency is any commitment to change or growth. Real honesty about flaws comes paired with effort to address them. If someone tells you they struggle with jealousy and they're genuinely self-aware, they're also working on it. They're in therapy, they're reading books, they're actively trying to manage that tendency because they don't want it to harm the relationship. Strategic transparency involves admission without effort, disclosure without change. It's honesty as a weapon, not as a foundation for growth. A truly honest partner doesn't use their self-awareness as an excuse for bad behavior. They share their struggles as context for the work they're doing, not as a reason you should accept being treated poorly. They don't warn you about their flaws and then repeatedly demonstrate those flaws without consequence. They understand that honesty creates accountability, not immunity. The 16th subtle sign is emotional withholding as punishment. This is different from someone who needs space when upset or who processes emotions internally. This is deliberate withdrawal of affection, attention, or emotional connection as a response to you displeasing him, and it's done in ways that deny you the ability to address it directly. You do something he doesn't like. Maybe you make plans with friends, express a boundary, or fail to respond to a text quickly enough. His response isn't to communicate his displeasure. Instead, he becomes distant. His texts are short and infrequent. He's less affectionate. He seems preoccupied or disinterested. When you ask if something's wrong, he says he's fine, but his behavior tells a different story. This creates a horrible dynamic. You know something has shifted. You can feel the coldness, the distance, but because he won't acknowledge it, you can't address it. You're left to guess what you did wrong, to replay your recent interactions, to analyze everything, trying to identify your offense. The not knowing is agonizing. The withdrawal of his warmth and presence is painful. You find yourself apologizing, trying to fix things, even though you're not sure what you're fixing. Eventually, you identify what upset him. You adjust your behavior, you make amends, you prove you've learned your lesson. Slowly, his warmth returns. The crisis passes. But the lesson has been learned, perhaps unconsciously. Displeasing him results in emotional exile. To maintain his affection, You need to avoid triggering his withdrawal. Over time, you become hypervigilant to his moods, constantly adjusting to keep him happy, to prevent the next freeze-out. What makes this particularly destructive is that it trains you to prioritize his emotions over your own needs. If setting a boundary results in him withdrawing affection, you learn not to set boundaries. If having your own plans results in the silent treatment, you learn to keep your schedule open for him. If expressing a different opinion results in coldness, you learn to agree or stay silent. Emotional withholding is a form of control that doesn't involve overt aggression. He's not yelling or threatening. He's just becoming unavailable, and somehow this quiet punishment is more destabilizing than a clear argument would be. An argument can be resolved. Silent withdrawal just lingers, poisoning the atmosphere, leaving you desperate to fix it without the tools to do so. A healthy partner communicates when they're upset. They might need time to cool down, but they say so. They don't leave you guessing. They don't punish you with silence and distance. They understand that withdrawing affection as punishment is emotionally abusive, and they refuse to use love and connection as bargaining chips. When there's conflict, they address it directly. When they need space, they communicate that need. They don't make you anxiously scramble to regain their approval through guesswork and appeasement. The 17th subtle sign is what I call revisionist history. This is when he gradually changes the story of your relationship, your past interactions, or your agreements to suit his current needs or to avoid accountability. It's a form of gaslighting that happens so slowly you might not notice until the narrative has been completely rewritten. You remember the early days of your relationship as him pursuing you, being interested and engaged. Over time, he starts suggesting it was actually you who pursued him. He frames himself as having been reluctant or uncertain, and you as having pushed for the relationship. This retroactive revision serves to diminish your value. If he was the reluctant party who you convinced, then you should be grateful he gave you a chance, not expecting him to treat you well. Or you had clear agreements about the nature of your relationship. Maybe you were exclusive, or you had discussed expectations about communication frequency. Later, when he violates these agreements, he claims they were never that clear. He remembers things differently. You're taking casual conversations and treating them like binding commitments. Somehow, what you clearly understood as an agreement is now portrayed as your misunderstanding or unrealistic expectation. Revisionist history also applies to specific events. You remember a birthday he forgot. He says he didn't forget. He just celebrated in a different way than you expected. You remember a promise he broke. He says it wasn't a promise. It was a possibility he mentioned that didn't work out. Every disappointment, every letdown, every instance of him failing to show up for you is reframed as your misinterpretation or unreasonable expectation. Over time, you start to doubt your own memories and perceptions. If his version of events consistently differs from yours, and he seems so certain, maybe your memory is faulty. Maybe you did misunderstand. Maybe you're creating problems by holding on to a version of events that isn't accurate. This doubt serves him perfectly. If you can't trust your own memory, you can't hold him accountable to past promises, agreements, or patterns of behavior. What's particularly insidious about revisionist history is that it often includes revising your emotions and reactions. You remember being upset about something. He says you're exaggerating, that you weren't that upset, or that you got upset about something different than what you think. He's not just rewriting facts, he's rewriting your emotional reality, telling you that what you felt wasn't what you actually felt. A person who values truth doesn't need to constantly revise the past. Their story stays consistent because it's based in reality. They might remember details differently, but they don't systematically rewrite history to paint themselves in a better light or you in a worse one. They certainly don't tell you that your memories or feelings are wrong when those memories would hold them accountable. They understand that a shared reality, even when it includes their mistakes or shortcomings, is the foundation of trust. The 18th subtle sign is affection as transaction. This is when his affection, attention, or romantic gestures are clearly tied to your compliance, your usefulness, or your performance, rather than being expressions of genuine care for you as a person. Notice when he's most affectionate. Is it after you've done something for him, agreed to something he wanted, or made a sacrifice? Is it when you're being agreeable, easy, fun? And notice when the affection disappears. Is it when you've asserted a need, set a boundary, or been going through something that makes you less available to meet his needs? This pattern reveals that his affection isn't about you, it's about what you do for him. You're rewarded for pleasing him and punished through withdrawal when you don't. This creates a transactional dynamic where you're essentially earning affection through behavior rather than receiving it as a natural expression of someone's feelings for you. Affection as transaction also shows up in more explicit forms. He might be romantic or loving when he wants something. He's suddenly attentive and sweet when he wants sex, when he needs a favor, when he's about to ask you for something he knows you won't want to give. The affection is a tool to soften you up, to make you more receptive, to make saying no harder. What makes this particularly painful is that you likely crave this affection. When he's being loving and attentive, it feels good. It reminds you of why you're in the relationship. It gives you hope that this is who he really is, or who he could consistently be. So, you keep trying to earn more of it. You keep performing, complying, suppressing your needs, hoping to generate more of those moments of warmth and connection. But transactional affection is hollow. It's not based on who you are, it's based on what you do. And what you do will never be enough, because the goal isn't your happiness, it's his satisfaction and control. As soon as the favor is granted, the sex is had, the compliance is achieved, the affection diminishes until the next time he needs something. A loving partner's affection is consistent. They're warm and attentive not because you've earned it, but because they care about you. Their feelings don't fluctuate based on your usefulness to them. They want to make you feel loved, even when, especially when, things are difficult, or when you're not at your best. Their affection is a gift freely given, not a reward contingent on your behavior. If you've recognized even a few of these patterns in your relationship, I want you to know something crucial. You're not crazy. You're not oversensitive. You're not imagining things. What you're experiencing is real, and it's not your fault. These subtle forms of emotional manipulation are designed to fly under the radar, to make you question yourself, to erode your confidence so slowly that you don't notice it happening until you're already deep in the dynamic. The reason these tactics are so effective with mature, experienced women is precisely because of your strengths. You're empathetic, so you give the benefit of the doubt. You're patient, so you wait for change that never comes. You're self-aware, so when he suggests you're the problem, you genuinely examine yourself. You're loyal, so you don't give up easily on people or relationships. These are beautiful qualities, qualities that make you a remarkable partner for someone who deserves you. But in the hands of a manipulator, these same qualities become vulnerabilities to be exploited. I want to talk for a moment about what happens when you start recognizing these patterns. The awareness can be painful. It might mean acknowledging that someone you care about, someone you've invested time and emotion in, someone you may love, has been treating you in ways that aren't acceptable. It might mean recognizing that you've tolerated disrespect, that your boundaries have been violated, that your sense of reality has been undermined. This recognition can bring up feelings of shame or embarrassment. How did I let this happen? How did I not see this sooner? Please, be gentle with yourself. Manipulation is effective precisely because it's hard to detect, especially when it's done by someone who's skilled at it, someone you trust, someone who knows your vulnerabilities. The fact that you didn't recognize it immediately doesn't mean you're weak or foolish. It means you're human and you approach the relationship with good faith and trust, which is exactly how relationships should be approached. What matters now is what you do with this awareness. Knowledge is power, and now you have knowledge. You can start to see the patterns clearly. You can start to trust your own perceptions again. You can start to understand that your discomfort, your unease, your sense that something's off, those aren't signs that you're too sensitive. They're signs that your intuition is working, that some part of you recognizes the manipulation, even if you haven't had the language to name it until now. If you're in a relationship with these dynamics, you have choices to make. Those choices are yours alone, and they're not simple. Maybe you'll decide to address these patterns directly, to have honest conversations about what needs to change. Maybe you'll seek couples counseling if your partner is willing. Maybe you'll set firmer boundaries and see if he respects them. Or maybe you'll realize that the healthiest choice is to leave, to prioritize your well-being over the relationship. Whatever you choose, please make sure you're not isolated in this decision. Reach out to trusted friends or family members. Consider individual therapy to help you process what you've experienced and to strengthen your sense of self. Connect with other women who've been through similar dynamics. You need support, perspective, and validation from people who care about your well-being, not from the person who's been undermining it. I also want to address something important. Not every difficult relationship involves manipulation. Sometimes two people are genuinely incompatible. Sometimes someone has real struggles or limitations that affect the relationship without being manipulative. The key difference is pattern and intent. Does this person take accountability and make real efforts to change? Do they respect your boundaries even when it's inconvenient for them? Do they want you to feel secure and valued, even if they're not always perfect at creating that? Or are your needs consistently subordinated to theirs? Are you constantly confused, anxious, or doubting yourself? Is there a pattern of your reality being denied or your perceptions being undermined? Trust yourself to know the difference. Trust that you deserve a relationship where you feel valued, secure, and respected. Trust that being alone is better than being with someone who makes you feel small, crazy, or unworthy. And trust that recognizing these patterns, naming them, and choosing to no longer accept them is an act of profound self-respect and strength. For those of you watching who aren't currently in this dynamic but recognize it from past relationships, I want to say, you survived. You got out, or the relationship ended, and you're here now with more wisdom and awareness. Use what you learned. Trust your instincts more quickly in the future. Don't ignore red flags out of hope or loneliness or the desire to give someone the benefit of the doubt. Your past experiences, as painful as they were, have taught you valuable lessons about what you will and won't tolerate. Honor those lessons. And for those of you who are watching this on behalf of someone you care about, a friend, a family member, a daughter or sister who you suspect is being manipulated, thank you for seeking to understand what she might be going through. The best thing you can do is be a consistent, non-judgmental presence in her life. Don't badmouth her partner, as this might make her defensive and push her away. Instead, ask questions, express concern for her well-being, remind her of who she is, of her strength and value. Let her know that you're there for her whenever she's ready to talk or needs support. Sometimes just knowing that someone sees what's happening and cares can be a lifeline. Before we close, I want to leave you with this. You are not too old to start over. You are not too invested to walk away. You are not too damaged to be loved well. You are not asking for too much when you want respect, honesty, and genuine care. The right person won't make you feel like you're hard to love. They won't make you earn affection or prove your worth. They won't keep you in a constant state of uncertainty or anxiety. They will see your value clearly and treat you accordingly. If this video has helped you gain clarity, If it's given you language for experiences you couldn't quite name, if it's made you feel less alone in what you've been going through, please let me know. Hit that like button to show this content resonates with you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or experiences. Your story might be exactly what another woman needs to hear to realize she's not alone. Share this video with any woman who might benefit from this information. Post it to your social media, send it to a friend. Help spread awareness about these subtle manipulation tactics. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do so now and turn on notifications. This channel is dedicated to providing content that empowers women, particularly mature women, to recognize their worth and demand the treatment they deserve. There's so much more to discuss, so many more topics to cover, and I don't want you to miss any of it. And if you've found exceptional value in this content, if it's genuinely helped you or someone you care about, consider supporting this channel with a super thanks. Your financial support allows me to continue creating in-depth, thoroughly researched content on topics that matter to women's well-being and empowerment. It's entirely optional, but deeply appreciated and directly enables this work to continue and expand. Remember, recognizing manipulation isn't about blaming yourself for being vulnerable to it. It's about empowering yourself with the knowledge to recognize it early, to trust your instincts, and to choose relationships and people who enhance your life rather than diminish it. You deserve to be with someone who makes you feel more like yourself, not less. Someone who celebrates your strength rather than undermining it. Someone who adds to your peace rather than creating constant turmoil. Trust yourself. Believe in your worth, and never settle for less than genuine, consistent, respectful love. You've survived too much and overcome too much to accept anything less. Thank you so much for watching. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next video.